For 6 months, I smiled through every dinner, every awkward silence, every small humiliation, and they had absolutely no idea I had already spoken to my attorney. Let me back up. My name is Theodore. Theo to everyone who's known me longer than a handshake. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed structural engineer, mostly commercial builds, a few bridges, one hospital wing I'm still proud of. My wife, Carol, passed 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. That's the kind of thing that rearranges everything inside you. After she was gone, the house felt like a museum of a life I used to have. 4 bedrooms, a yard I kept mowing out of habit, memories in every corner that I hadn't asked to live with. So when my daughter suggested I sell and move in with her and her husband, I thought it was the kindest thing anyone had said to me since the eulogy. Her name is Elise. She's 36, a pediatric nurse, and when Carol was sick, Elise drove 2 hours every single weekend to sit with her mother. I never forgot that. I never will. She's a good person. She was. Or maybe she still is underneath everything. I'm still working that part out. Her husband is a man named Darren. I want to be fair here, so I'll say this. When I first met Darren, 6 years ago at their backyard engagement party, he shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and told me he'd always take care of her. I believed him. I thought, this is a man with some backbone. I was not entirely wrong about that. The backbone was there. The direction it was pointing, though, that took me longer to figure out. The arrangement was simple, at least on paper. I sold my house, the one Carol and I bought in 1987, the one where Elise learned to ride a bike on the driveway, where we painted the kitchen 3 different shades of yellow before we got it right. I sold it for $412,000. Darren had a plan. He said if I contributed $200,000 toward an addition on their property, they'd build me a proper in-law suite attached to the house, private entrance, full bath, small kitchenette. He showed me sketches on his laptop. It looked beautiful. It looked like dignity. I wrote the check. I kept the rest in savings. I moved into their guest room while the addition was being built, which Darren said would take about 4 months. That was 18 months ago. The addition never broke ground. I found that out gradually. First, it was the permits taking longer than expected. Then it was the contractor being backed up. Then it was Darren saying the lumber costs had gone through the roof and asking if I could contribute a little more to cover the difference. I gave him another $12,000, then another $8,000. Then I stopped asking about the timeline because every time I did, Elise would get this look on her face. Not angry, just tired, like I was the one creating a problem by bringing it up. Meanwhile, I was living in their guest room, which fine. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was temporary, and we both knew it, and after 8 months it started to feel less like a guest room and more like a holding cell. Then Elise got pregnant. I want to be very clear, I was overjoyed. The idea of a grandchild, Carol would have wept. I wept in the car, alone, on the way home from the restaurant where they told me. Happy tears, every one of them. But I noticed something at that dinner table, in the way Darren looked at me right after they made the announcement. He smiled, but his eyes went somewhere else, like he was calculating. 2 weeks later, he sat me down. He said they were going to need the guest room for the nursery. That was reasonable. I understood that before he finished the sentence. But then he said they'd been talking, and they thought the best solution was for me to move into the basement. The basement. I sat with that for a moment. Their basement is unfinished. Concrete floor, a water heater in one corner. One small window at ground level that looks out at the side of the fence. There's a bathroom down there, a half bath, no shower. I would have to come upstairs to bathe, I said. What about the other bedroom? The one across from the master? Darren said that was going to be Elise's home office. She was going to reduce her hours at the clinic after the baby came and do some telehealth from home. They needed the space. I looked at Elise. She was looking at the table. I said, so the plan is for me to sleep in the basement. Darren said, we'd fix it up, put in some carpet maybe. Add a space heater. Space heater. I'm 64 years old with a bad hip and 31 years of honest work behind me, and the offer on the table was a space heater and a half bath with no shower. I said I'd think about it. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I was angry. The anger came later. That night I was just bewildered. I kept thinking about the check I had written. $200,000, then 12, then 8. I kept thinking about the addition that never got built. I kept thinking about the way Darren had looked at me across that restaurant table. I thought about Carol. I thought about what she would have said. She had a way of cutting through things without raising her voice. She would have said, "Theo, stop being polite. Look at what's actually happening." So I looked. What was actually happening was this. I had given my son-in-law $220,000. There was no addition. There was no in-law suite. There was no private entrance or full bath or small kitchenette. There was a basement with a space heater and a man who thought I would accept it because I had nowhere else to go. I have a brother, older than me by 4 years, retired, lives up in Vermont. His name is Walt. I called him that night, around 11 o'clock. He answered on the second ring, which is the kind of brother he is. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Have you talked to a lawyer yet?" I hadn't, but I did the next morning. Her name is Patricia Ossie. She's an estate and family law attorney I found through a referral from a colleague I used to work with. I sat in her office with a folder of every document I had. The bank wire confirmation for $200,000, the personal check stubs for the additional $20,000, the text messages from Darren about the permits and the contractor and the lumber costs. I also had the original sketch he'd shown me on his laptop, which I'd had the foresight to photograph on my phone. She looked through everything and then looked at me. She said, "This money was given for a specific agreed purpose, construction of a living space on their property. That purpose was never fulfilled. That's not a gift. That's a breach of agreement, and potentially a few other things we'd want to look at carefully." She told me not to move into the basement. She told me not to move anywhere, actually, until we understood the full picture. She told me to start documenting everything, dates, conversations, any requests made of me, and she told me not to tell Darren or Elise that I had spoken to her. I drove home. I went inside. Elise was in the kitchen making soup, and she asked me how my day was, and I said fine, and I sat down at the table and watched her move around and thought about how much she looked like Carol when she was focused on something. I didn't say anything about the lawyer. I started keeping notes in a small spiral notebook that I left in my car. Every conversation, every date, every time Darren mentioned the addition and gave a reason why it wasn't happening, I wrote it all down in the parking lot before I went back inside. There were a few things I noticed during those weeks that I hadn't let myself see clearly before. Darren worked from home, doing something in financial consulting that he described differently almost every time he explained it. He drove a truck that was newer than anything I'd ever owned. He'd bought a boat last summer. Nothing extravagant, he said. Just a fishing boat, just something to get out on the water, and I'd nodded and thought nothing of it. Now I was thinking about it. I also started paying attention to what didn't happen. The addition didn't happen. Any concrete answer about the timeline didn't happen. Any acknowledgement that $220,000 was sitting somewhere, having done nothing, didn't happen. I called Patricia once a week. She was building something. Then came the dinner, the one I think about when I try to understand how people can make themselves comfortable with cruelty. It was a Saturday. Elise had made her mother's pot roast recipe. She does this sometimes, pulls out Carol's handwritten recipe cards, and the three of us were sitting at the table. Darren had been on his phone before dinner and seemed distracted. Halfway through the meal, without looking up from his plate, he said he'd been talking to someone about the basement, and there was a way to put in a proper egress window, which would make it technically a habitable bedroom under code. I said, "When is that happening?" He said, "We're looking at mid-February." I said, "Darren, the addition was supposed to be done 14 months ago." And he put down his fork and he looked at me and he said, calmly, evenly, like he was explaining something to someone who was being slow. He said, "We've been over this. Things cost more than expected. You knew that going in." I said, "I knew lumber prices were up. I didn't know there would be no construction at all." His voice went up slightly, not shouting but pointed. He said, "I've given you a roof over your head for 18 months. Most people would be grateful." I heard myself say, "I paid for that roof." And then Darren looked at me and said, "And I want to make sure I get this right, because I've thought about it 100 times. He said, "Look, the basement option is on the table. That's what we can offer. If that doesn't work for you, maybe it's time to look at other arrangements. I was 64 years old. I had given this man $220,000, and he was telling me that a concrete basement with a half bath was the offer, take it or start looking at other arrangements. Elise said nothing. She was looking at her plate. I said, "I'll think about it." Same as before. But this time I meant something different by it. I called Patricia the next morning. I told her what had happened at dinner. She told me we were ready to move. She had filed the necessary paperwork for a civil claim, unjust enrichment, breach of oral contract, fraudulent misrepresentation, and she had also, very quietly, had a forensic accountant look at some things. What the accountant found was not pretty. Darren had received the wire transfer of $200,000 into a joint account he shared with Elise. Within 6 weeks, approximately $160,000 of it had been moved to a separate account in his name only. The remaining $60,000 had gone toward actual renovation work. Not on an addition, but on their kitchen and master bath, which had been redone beautifully while I was living upstairs. He hadn't built me an addition. He had renovated his kitchen. I'm going to be honest about what I felt when Patricia told me that. I didn't feel surprised. That might be the saddest part. I'd been keeping that notebook for 3 months, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I'd already written the ending. But there was still a physical sensation, a dropping, somewhere in the chest, when you hear a thing confirmed that you'd hoped might not be true. I also thought about Elise, whether she knew, whether she was complicit or just a woman who'd been easier to live with when she didn't look too closely. I still don't have a clean answer to that. Patricia advised me to find somewhere to stay before we served the papers. She said it could get tense. I called Walt in Vermont and he said, "Come up whenever you need to." I told him not yet, but soon. Then something happened that I didn't plan, but that I think was necessary. One evening, Darren was on a call in the living room and I walked through with a glass of water, and I heard him on the phone saying, "This is close to verbatim," because I went directly to my car and wrote it down. He said, "He's not going anywhere. Where's he going to go? He's got nothing left." He didn't know I was standing in the hallway. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Then I made 2 phone calls. One was to Walt. One was to a real estate agent I'd worked with years ago, a woman named June, who sells properties along the coast about 40 minutes from here. I told her what I was looking for. She sent me 3 listings that evening. The next morning, while Darren was on his call and Elise was at her prenatal appointment, I drove down to look at them. The third one was a house. Small, 2 bedrooms, a covered porch that faces the water. Cedar shake siding that's going gray in a way that looked intentional. A kitchen with a window above the sink where you can see a strip of ocean between 2 houses across the street. The yard needs work. I don't mind yard work. The price was $280,000. I had enough in savings if I was careful. June walked me through it twice. On the second walkthrough, I stood in the kitchen and looked out that window for a long time. I put in an offer that afternoon, cash. It was accepted by Thursday. I didn't say anything to Darren or Elise. I just started quietly organizing my things. I didn't have much in their house. Most of what I owned was in a storage unit across town that I'd been paying $60 a month on since I sold my house. I went there one afternoon and walked through and thought about what I'd need. Patricia served the papers on a Tuesday. Darren called me 4 times that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. The 5th time I picked up, he wasn't shouting. He was very controlled, which almost made it worse. He said this was a misunderstanding. He said the money had been managed properly and there were records. He said Patricia was making accusations that had no merit. He said, "I think we need to talk about this as a family." I said, "Darren, we're past that." He said, "What do you want exactly? You want the money back?" "We don't have it." I said, "That's between our attorneys now." He said, "Elise is pregnant. This is going to cause her stress." I said, "You should have thought about that." And I hung up. Elise called me that evening. She was crying, not performing, actually crying, and she said she didn't know about the separate account. She said she thought the construction had been delayed for real reasons. She said she was so sorry. I believed the crying. I wasn't sure about everything else. I told her I loved her and I hoped she and the baby were healthy, and I told her that the situation wasn't her fault, but that I had to protect myself. She asked where I was going to go. I told her I'd already bought a house. There was a long silence. She said, "When?" I said, "Last Thursday." Another silence. Then very quietly she said, "Good for you, Dad." I moved out on a Saturday morning. Walt drove down from Vermont and helped me load everything into a truck. It took 3 hours. We stopped for lunch at a diner on the way to the coast. He had the patty melt. I had coffee and scrambled eggs. We didn't talk much, but it was the best meal I'd had in 18 months. The legal process took time. These things always do. Darren hired an attorney, and there were depositions and documents and a lot of tense emails between Patricia and his lawyer. But the paper trail was clean. Wire confirmations, account records, text messages where Darren had promised a completed addition, the forensic accountant's report, the kitchen renovation that had been done with my money and never mentioned. We settled out of court. I can't say the exact terms, but I can say that I recovered the majority of what had been taken. It wasn't perfect. It's never entirely perfect. But it was enough to sit on that covered porch and look out at the water and feel like a man who hadn't been foolish, just too trusting, which is a different thing entirely. I see Elise occasionally. She had a little girl, my granddaughter, born in April. We meet for lunch sometimes, the three of us, carefully. She and Darren are still together, which is a choice I've decided to stop trying to understand. She holds the baby and talks to me about work and asks about the yard and the porch, and we don't talk about the money or the basement or the dinner that started all of this. Not yet. Maybe someday. The porch is good. I put a rocking chair out there that was Carol's. It was in the storage unit, wrapped in a moving blanket, perfectly intact. I carry my coffee out there in the morning, and I sit and I listen to the water, and I think about how strange it is that the worst thing that happened to me in the last 4 years led me to the exact place I probably needed to be. I didn't want to be the kind of man who sues his own son-in-law. I didn't want any of this. But I also learned that being kind is not the same as being silent, and trusting family is not the same as having no memory. They thought I had nothing left. They had no idea what I was building.